Hi YouTube, it's Kathy, and this is my February 2020 reading wrap-up. If you're not already aware, I do weekly entertainment wrap-ups of everything I read, watch, and listen to, but today we're just talking about the books. This month I participated in Valentine's, Blackathon, and Contemporary-a-thon, and finished all of the challenges trying to do so with as few books as possible, and I still managed to read more books than I read in January. I don't know how this matches up compared to my 2019 reading pace. I have a feeling that I'm either at it or surpassing it, which is the opposite of what I wanted for this year, but I have some time coming up where I'm sure I won't read too much, so it'll even out. I'm gonna start with the nerdy hardcore stats and charts and then get into what I read. In February, I read 22 books for a total of 6,639 pages. This takes into account converting audiobook minutes to pages, so about 3,130 of those pages were actually about 83 hours of audio. The age breakdown for these books was 13 adult books, 6 YA books, and 3 middle grade books. I read 18 novels, 3 graphic novels, and 1 novella. This month the biggest chunk of what I read was contemporary, followed by fantasy, then non-fiction, speculative fiction, historical fiction, and then possibly my first ever science fantasy. If you adjust by page count, specfic gets slightly inflated, but that's about it. Most of these books came from the library, but I also read some from NetGalley, a free book, and 1 cent from the author. I read 4 paperbacks, 10 audiobooks, 2 hardcover, and 6 ebooks. Almost all of these books were between 200 and 399 pages, and the vast majority were published in the 2010s, but I did read a couple older books. Almost all of these books were by female authors, with a few male authors, a non-binary author, and a book co-authored by a female and non-binary couple, and most of the protagonists were female. In terms of setting, a lot of these books were set in the United States and other worlds, with others being set in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Nigeria. In terms of diversity, there was queer content, reads to do with race, mental health, and disability, and some that had combinations therein, but about 9% of the books had no significant diversity. I think that this is the lowest this number has ever been, and this pleases me. In terms of star ratings this month, I had 1 3-star book, 3 3.5-star books, 13 4-star books, 3 4.5-star books, and 2 5-star books. Let's start with the lowest rated and work our way up to the highest, shall we? Kathy from editing here. There was a book that didn't make it onto my reading spreadsheet that I did read during this month. I'm gonna add it to all my stats, but I'm not gonna redo everything that I just filmed just to include it. That book was called No One Likes a Fart. It was a kid's book. It was about this fart that comes into being and then just wants to find a friend, and it was actually pretty great. Highly recommend if you need a book for a child, or if you're a 12-year-old at heart like I am. One 3-star read I had this month was called House of Whispers. This is a graphic novel in the Sandman universe, and I think it was only 3 stars because I didn't really know any of the characters going into it. This is kind of like a one-shot. It is just about this very specific situation, but I haven't read Sandman for a very long time, and I don't think I finished the original run of it, so I got to this, and the main character that I remember from Sandman, the titular Sandman, has retired, and there's all these other characters, and although they were interesting, I spent a lot of time going, I don't know what's happening. So it was great art and an interesting story, and there were queer elements, and all of that was wonderful, but it was just kind of meh because I didn't have the context to really love it. On my 3.5-star reads, the first one being the audiobook of The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. I am going to be honest, I picked up this book solely based on the title. I thought it was funny, and that's the only reason I read it. I didn't actually know what this was going in. I didn't even think about what it was going in. I assumed it was kind of a self-help book, and that's exactly what it ended up being. A lot of the advice in this book consists of things you've probably heard before, but just in different ways, and talked about in a more easygoing, casual manner, which I appreciated. I also love when a book will just drop an F-bomb because it can. Also, I may have had the song I've No More Fucks to Give stuck in my head pretty much the entire time I was listening to it, so I will link that song because it's amazing. In essence, this isn't about not giving any fucks whatsoever, it's about being very specific where you give your fucks. It's all about finding something to care about and then not worrying too much about the things that are outside of what you actually care about. This is all pretty decent advice, however, it is basically things I've just heard before said in a different way. I did enjoy his personal stories that kind of brought his points home, so if it sounds like something that would be interested to you, it is worth reading. My next 3.5-star read was War Girls. I actually had a really difficult time this month rating things. I didn't really give star ratings to my books before I started doing monthly wrap-ups, and this month it just seemed like I was blanket 4-starring most things. And it's gotten to the point where sometimes I feel bad for not giving things higher star ratings, and that's just weird. I don't really like that. But in any case, this book is about a civil war in Nigeria set in the future. There are these two sisters that we start out with, and they get separated at one point, and there are many, many things that happen with this dynamic. This book was incredibly hard to read at times, not because the writing was poor or I was uninterested in the characters, but because of the brutality of war, and that's kind of the point of the book. At least one of the points. This is all about child soldiers and how freaking terrible that is, so it was hard to read from that standpoint. But then there were also these giant action sequences where it seemed like something out of a Marvel movie at points, but like way more gut-punching, because these are literal children being mechanized and just being tools of war, and it was a lot. It's the first in a trilogy. The rest of the trilogy isn't out because this is a new book as of last year. I don't know if I can continue, quite honestly, just because it hurt my heart so much, but I also feel like it's something that I needed to read because I don't know about a lot of the conflicts that were not taught in school in North America. So this is a gateway into learning about conflicts in other areas, but also is really painful for me to just learn about people that hate each other for no other reason than they've been told to hate each other. Next, something with a completely different type of emotional turmoil and a happy ending, we have Twice in a Blue Moon by Christina Lauren. This is about a girl named Tate who goes to London on a trip when she turns 18 with her grandmother. It's basically her graduation present and a birthday present all rolled into one. And on the first day, they meet this boy and his grandfather, who are also traveling from the States and also going to be in London about the same time. And it turns out they're staying in the same place, so they see a lot of each other on this trip. Tate isn't really looking for something romantic, but Sam is also really tall and really cute, and why can't they get to know each other? I didn't know anything about this book going in, I just knew that something was going to happen and this was going to be some form of a second chance romance. And I could kind of piece together why the event that split them apart happened ahead of time, but I still definitely had problems loving the love interest in this as much, and also I was thrown off by how terrible her dad was. So although I enjoyed this story, and it definitely made me feel a lot of the feels, which is what I want out of a Christina Lauren book, to be perfectly honest, I think that this was my least favorite. That being said, it's not like I didn't enjoy this book. I'm just thinking that if I were to rank their books that I've read so far, this is my least favorite, which you would think it would be more of a favorite because it has to do with acting and theater and that type of thing. So take that as you will. Next, we're getting into the incredibly long list of my 4-star reads that I had this month because I just felt like I didn't know how to rate anything, so almost everything got 4 stars. I also make it a point to put my rereads at the beginning of whatever star category they fall into, so my first 4-star read was a reread of Looking for Alaska. I read this back in 2013. I actually read all of John's books that had been published up until that point in a 3-week period because that's when I found the Vlogbrothers, and I have a whole funny story about the abundance of Catherine's and my friend buying it in a bookstore while we were abroad and all of these things. So when I got back and realized that he also has this YouTube channel that my friend really liked and I watched a lot of it, I basically tried to catch up on all of it. I mostly did a reread of this one because I had to do a reread for Valentine's, and 2 because I just finished watching the Hulu adaptation, which I felt was a really great adaptation because it expanded on things that definitely could have been expanded upon in the book. It also cleaned up and advanced a couple of things. For example, the book does use the R word, which was definitely a thing you saw a lot more of in books that were published in 2006, but I can't bring myself to 5-star a book that has ableist language like that isn't challenged. This book is all about Miles, who's going off to boarding school. He wants to basically do some life learning. He falls into this crowd of people, and this book is split between before and after, and going in, I didn't know what that middle event was going to be. I wasn't looking for what it was going to be, and it's definitely devastating if you don't already know what it is. Even though this book has its flaws, I find it entertaining. It definitely made me feel a lot of feels. There are definitely some crying moments, and also the audiobook is narrated by Will Wheaton, but he either must know John or be a fan of John because the speaking cadence he used for Miles' voice is very much like John Green was reading his own book, which was a little bit weird, but I was into it. Next we have the Subtweet by Vivek Shraya. This was an arc. I don't think this one is out until April, but I can't remember because I'm trash. This book centers 2 women, although we do get the perspectives of a couple of other women throughout this book about this situation and events leading up to this situation. The situation in question is there is this musical artist who wrote a song, and then there is this kind of hobby artist who just kind of did a cover of it and put it up on YouTube, and that ends up blowing up and is actually better than the original. This ends up being about fame and jealousy and friendship and a lot of different complicated emotions, and we get to see this situation of this friendship coming together between these two women and then blowing up over a subtweet. I found the format and the pacing of this quite fascinating. We really got to know these characters. I really wish it was a little bit longer, but that's my biggest complaint about it, which is not a terrible one to have. Next we have Abbot, which is a graphic novel I read way at the beginning of the month, and it's about this journalist who lives in the 1970s in Detroit, and there's something paranormal happening in her city. And honestly, my memory is a little bit patchy on this. I definitely enjoyed the artwork. I definitely enjoyed that it ended up being queer out of nowhere. I enjoyed that it talked about the society of Detroit at the time and how white people were moving out of certain neighborhoods and how that wasn't great for the economy and all of these different things. But it's just not something I can rave about, if that makes any sense. Like, I really enjoyed it, but it's not something that I'm like, holy crap, everyone needs to read this, which is weird because it dealt with all of these topics that people should read. I think this was just a really weird reading month for me, to be honest. Next we have Matilda by Roald Dahl. Yes, for some reason I had never read this in my youth. I've also still not seen the movie, although it's on my very long list of things to do. Matilda, if you've never read it, is about a precocious little girl who teaches herself to read because her family is pretty much trash, and it gets to the point where every time they're trash, she starts pulling pranks on them, which are quite hilarious. When she gets to school, her teacher is amazing. The headmistress is a terrible, terrible person who actually abuses children, and that was the hardest part to read because I know that this type of thing is supposed to be very whimsical, but I was just very protective of all the children that were being abused by this headmistress. I consumed this as an audiobook that was narrated by Kate Winslet, and she did an amazing job because she had different voices for all the characters, and she was acting it very, very well. The sound mastering wasn't the best because she would be talking in her normal tone of voice for kind of the narrating parts, and then there were a lot of adults that would just be screaming, and she would scream, and they wouldn't like master it in such a way that you didn't have to like turn the volume up and down all the time while listening to it. So that made me very uncomfortable on the bus, up and down and up and down and up and down. But other than that, it was amazing. Because of this, I actually have more Roald Dahl audiobooks on hold that I'm going to be listening to in March because I want to. I only remember reading one Roald Dahl book when I was an actual child, and that was The Twits, and I'm going to be rereading it this month, and I'm very excited. Next we have another middle grade. This one is called Dragons in a Bag. This is about a little boy named Jackson whose mom drops him off at this woman's house because she needs to go to court because they might be losing their apartment, they might be getting evicted. So basically he just needs to stay with this woman he's never met before for the day while his mom goes and deals with this. While he's there, he finds out that this woman has an interesting occupation and an interesting few creatures happen to be in her purse. You can probably figure out what those creatures are. That's the first word in the title. And from there they go on a pretty magical adventure to deliver these dragons to where they're supposed to go. This was a lot of fun. This was also the first in a series that I would love to continue because I really enjoyed the characters. I really enjoyed the kind of sense of duty that Jackson had to helping deliver these dragons, and the differing opinions on magic that were held by different characters in this book was also really cool. Next we have the novella I read this month, which was Caroline's Heart by Austin Chant. This one is about Roy, who is a transgendered man who is working on a ranch and just trying to keep a low profile, and one day he meets a witch by whom he is fascinated and who he's also attracted to, and he would really rather go work for this witch. This is only a 96-page book, so I don't want to give you too much of the synopsis, or I'm basically giving away the entire plot. What I do want to say is even though you only have 96 pages with these characters, it's impossible not to fall in love with their dynamic and just how open and honest they are with each other. And then also there's these magic elements because, hello, she is a witch. And then even though this is set in the Old West, which I probably should have mentioned, this does get very, very sexy towards the end, so look forward to that. Next we have The Dark Fantastic, which is basically a series of essays about people of color and how they are included or excluded in fantasy worlds. This goes into the depth about Harry Potter and the Hunger Games and Merlin and True Blood, I believe was one of them. And it goes over these different cycles and tropes that people of color in fantasy worlds often face. This also ended up focusing mostly on Black women in fantasy, which was a very specific point, and I really enjoyed learning these different backstories to these fandoms that I didn't necessarily know. For example, when the casting for the first Hunger Games movie came out and Rue was seen as a woman of color, Apparently the internet exploded about this because they didn't realize that she was a woman of color in the book. People were also very mad that Gwen in Merlin was played by a person of color because for some reason they've decided that black people didn't exist in England, and they also decided that this is England and not a made-up land called Camelot. I did have the concern going into the introduction, which was incredibly academic, and this is an academic book, that it was going to be kind of a slog to get through, but I ended up warming up to the subject matter, and then all of the terminology wasn't too much of a hurdle to overcome. On to something completely different, I also read the Bromance book club. This is about a baseball player who hits a grand slam one night and is having excellent sex with his wife that night, and she ends up coming, which is interesting because he's like, wait, what the hell was that? And she's like, I came, and he's like, I've never seen you do that before in our entire marriage, and it turns out she has been faking. This puts him in a little bit of a tizzy, and he actually stops talking to her for about a month, and then she asks him for a divorce. Once his baseball buddies find out that his marriage is on the rocks, they actually indoctrinate him into their secret book club, where they read romance novels to figure out the problems in their own relationships and how to fix them. This book was absolutely wonderful. It was great to see people discussing the genre of a romance novel within a romance novel itself, and talking about how people will look down on the genre because it's chick lit and it's just for women and it's frivolous, and no, that's not what it is. Even if you're reading something light and fluffy, you can't just look down on it for not being high literature. There are very often intricate elements of society in play in romance novels, and some of the academic feminist things that were coming out of these baseball players' mouths were just fantastic to see on the page. I very much enjoyed this. Apparently this is the beginning of a series, so I'm interested to see if it will just continue with bringing more people into this secret book club or how that's going to go. Very much enjoyed it. Next we have All the Better Part of Me. This is about an actor who's from the States, but he's working in London and he's trying to get parts. And he is getting some theater parts, but also he keeps flirting with his best friend back home, which is a little bit confusing to him because he hasn't really come out to himself as bisexual. He ends up getting this part in this movie and has this flirtation going on with a female director, but his heart is really back in Seattle, but he ends up wanting to go home and see if this flirting is actually a real thing between him and his friend. Firstly, it was very nice for me to have a protagonist who's figuring out they're bisexual a little bit later in life, because I didn't figure that out myself until I was 30 years old. So as much as it's great that some people know themselves very early on, and seeing that represented in books is wonderful, I also really appreciate seeing somebody older figuring themselves out. There's also something that happens in this book that completely throws the protagonist's life sideways that I didn't know about going into it, which is why I'm not telling you what it is, and I really enjoyed that aspect of it because we see these certain gender roles and people that step outside of these certain gender roles that are heavily discussed in this book are demonized or seen as weird depending on which gender you're talking about, and I really liked seeing the representation of how he took responsibility for that situation and how she didn't want to be in that situation, and how often the narrative is that those are reversed, and I just loved that whole situation. I love that this was a romance and dealing with his homophobic parents and his partner's parents being just absolutely wonderful, and seeing those different dynamics. I absolutely adored basically everything that happened in this book. Next we have two books that are a duology that I read back to back, and I actually read them out of order at the request of my friend Jocelyn, and that's Empire of Sand and Realm of Ash. The protagonists of these books are two sisters, and these books take place about 10 years apart, and there are things that you learn in each of these books that kind of overlap in the world, but you can definitely read these books out of order, and it is a great reading experience, which is how I did it. These two sisters are actually brought up in society. Their dad is high in society, and their mother was actually a woman from kind of the outskirts of society, this kind of nomadic type of people, and they use a lot of magic, which is feared and looked down upon by society. So the two sisters basically are told to ignore that part of their upbringing and their heritage, and they deal with this in two very different ways throughout the books, which is very, very interesting. I absolutely adored the writing in these books. I absolutely adored how these characters dealt with these circumstances. These books do have to deal with blood magic, so if blood or cutting is a trigger, just be careful of that. One of these books in particular deals heavily with the concept of consent and not wanting to seal a marriage by sleeping with each other because they're not there yet, and that whole dynamic was done so well. And I guess one of the elements that was very fascinating to me was seeing these characters in this very patriarchal society who happen to be women that wear head covering, and what happens if that is taken away from them, or what it means to them and why they do it, and all of those things being discussed. I really enjoyed seeing those elements. Next we have Ninth Life by Taylor B. Barton. This is the one that was sent to me directly from the author, and this one comes out in September, but I highly suggest pre-ordering it because this was fantastic. At the beginning of this book, we see this cat named Caesar. He is in his 8th life and he passes away, and going into his 9th life, he's given the option to be something other than a cat. Because he's just left this family behind that he absolutely truly loved, especially the girl in the family, he wants to come back to be close to her, and he actually ends up being put in the body of a 17-year-old boy. This causes some issues because the body he's put into, Austin, had his own life, and now he has to live that life, but also wants to find this girl. However, Austin had this on-again, off-again thing with his roommate, and his roommate now has to deal with Austin waking up and not knowing who he was previous, kind of like an amnesia moment, and what that means going forward. There was so much to love about this book. Firstly, the concept was very, very interesting and was explored throughout the book. Secondly, it was just so queer and just wonderful because of that. It opened up what it meant to be a person that feels feelings for more than one person at a time and what that means. And it talked about different styles of relationship, and I just thoroughly enjoyed my time with it. My final 4-star book was also hella queer, and that's Once and Future. This is a King Arthur retelling set in space and in the future, and it's the beginning of at least a duology. I don't know if it's going to continue after that, but I've actually had this book on my radar for quite a long time, and then I realized there was a sequel to it coming out, and I had thought it was a standalone, so I requested the sequel from NetGalley, got it, and then realized, okay, now is the time that I need to actually get to Once and Future. So this book is about Ari, who's the 42nd reincarnation of King Arthur, and it's all about Merlin finding Ari, realizing that for once Arthur is in the body of a girl, and then all of the different characters that are around Arthur almost always directly relate back to the first cycle of Arthur's. So Percival and Lancelot and Guinevere and all these types of people are also in this 17-year-old girl's life, and she ends up finding Excalibur, which is how Merlin finds her. Merlin also has a curse on him where he is aging backwards, so at this point he is also in the body of about a 17-year-old. I went into this not knowing a ton about Arthurian legend, but still very much enjoyed it because obviously we've heard these character names before. We've heard of King Arthur, we've heard of Merlin, we've heard of the Knights of the Round Table. And I think that's all you really need to know to go into it. Obviously, if I knew a little bit more about the mythology, I might pick up more of the references, but I was fine with what I got, and actually once I have finished this series, I think that is the time that I will look more into what the original myth was. I also have been meaning to watch the show Merlin, which has a very different take on these things, so I feel like this is now my new trend of consuming something on a specific topic. A little while ago it was mermaids and sirens, and now it might just be Arthurian legend. I really love how this played with prophecy and was a combination of science fiction and fantasy. Because there's scientific advancements, this does take place in space at points, they do go on spaceships and all of those things, but Merlin also has magic. And that's a combination that I don't know if I've ever seen it before. I'm sure other people have done it, I just don't know that I've consumed it before, and that was very exciting for me. We're in the home stretch here, I only have 5 more books to talk about, so we're on to my 4.5-star read. First one being Out of My Mind by Sharon Draper. This is about a little girl who is 10 years old, has cerebral palsy, and hasn't been able to talk to anybody before. She's incredibly intelligent and she loves words, but because she doesn't have an efficient method of communication, nobody in her life really knows how smart she is and how much she wants to talk to them. I definitely had some problems with this book. For example, the main character is fat phobic, and that is the thing that carries through the book. Also, there were a few things that were pointed out at my book club that I hadn't really thought of. Her mom is a very good advocate for her, but only up until a certain point. Like, her mom never thought hey, I know my kid is very intelligent, maybe we can do something about getting her to communicate that's more than just having a board that she can point to things on. It actually took the kid doing some research with the help of an aide to realize that she could get this machine that she could basically program with different words and make sentences out of and be able to talk to people that way. This was also this interesting mixture where it felt like she was in a small town and it was like in the 80s or the 90s, but also it was actually set in a city and like her classmates had cell phones and that types of things. So there were these little plot points that didn't make a lot of sense, such as her teacher saying that he didn't have her phone number when she's supposed to be on this school trip, and getting one of the other students who's like 10 to use her cell phone to call, which is not how that situation would have played out. All of those complaints aside, what I really did enjoy about this was it really does make you empathize and think about what it is like for people who have conditions where they can't speak the way that we speak. They can't communicate in the way that we're taught that everybody should be able to communicate. That's not how life is. So what I'm hoping is that kids that read this book get the message of being more inclusive towards people and understanding that not everybody is the same, and understanding that making allowances for other people is not treating them like they're special, it's just being a decent human being. Next, I also read Agnes Murderus. I read this as part of I Read Canadian, although only about a third of this takes place in Canada. That's fine. Written by Canadian, totally counts. This is about a historical figure, however we don't know a lot about her, and a lot of the writing about her didn't start popping up until about the 1970s, and she was around in the mid-1800s. So in the author's note of this graphic novel, it is talked about how she had to just kind of create some things that happen in Agnes's life and kind of embellish what she thought would be interesting, which I was fine with. I had never heard of this person before. Agnes has an incredibly rough start at life. She is a bastard. She is living on a small island in the Hebrides. Her grandmother is a town witch and everybody is scared of her, and she spends a lot of time trying to get out of those circumstances, eventually moves to London. Some things happen there that are pretty traumatic, and then she ends up moving to Canada, and you can probably guess that there's some murdering going on. It's during the gold rush. She basically owns a hotel and people start going missing who have stayed at her hotel. This is a pretty big graphic novel, but I read it in a single sitting and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And this also had queer elements that I didn't know going into it, so that was fun. I just love being surprised by random queer elements in historical fiction. Next we have The Bookish Life of Nina Hill. I was predisposed to like this because I love books. I love books about people who love books. Nina Hill works in a bookstore, has lots of books at home, loves spending her time reading books. She does do some social activities, such as she goes out and she's on this quiz team, and that's really important to her. And she was trying to date for the longest time, but just doesn't feel into it anymore. She's much more happy just going home, curling up with a cup of tea on her favorite sofa and reading with her cat Phil. However, a lot of things happen in her life all at the same time, which really throws her for a loop because she also has quite a bit of social anxiety and anxiety in general. And this ended up being the bibliophilic mental health romance that I didn't know I needed, but definitely enjoyed. There's also a ton of humor in this. I laughed out loud quite a few times while reading this book, and this character also has the tendency to go off on little tangents in her head, or out loud for that matter, because she has all this trivia floating around, and I really enjoyed that. I also enjoyed that we got to see in the head of her love interest and what things look like from his perspective, and also really got to know her friends and the people she worked at the bookstore with, and this whole new set of characters that she did not see coming, and the weird relationship she had with her mom and the nanny that she mostly grew up with, because her mom was basically like, here, raise this kid, I'm gonna go around the world being a photographer. So this book covered a lot of topics. It was very funny. If you like bookish books and you haven't read this one already, I highly recommend it. I used up an entire camera battery talking about the first 20 books on this list, which means that we are now to books 21 and 22, which are my 2 5-star reads. First of them is The Way I Used to Be by Amber Smith. This is a sexual assault book, so know that going in. We know about this assault from page 1, and it is all about how this protagonist deals with that, so if that's not something you're comfortable reading or hearing about, then maybe just skip forward until you see the next cover appear on the screen. It feels weird to talk about the enjoyment of reading a book like this because this isn't a topic that obviously is something that is enjoyable in and of itself. However, because this book has so much value and puts so many things in perspective and was just so beautifully written. This is something I definitely very much enjoyed and obviously recommend because it is one of my 5-star reads this month. From the very beginning, we see this very young protagonist who has been groomed by somebody who she thought she could trust. And although this traumatic event only takes place over the course of 5 or 10 minutes, it heavily affects her life going forward, and she ends up reacting to it in ways that we don't necessarily see in other media. Her life is threatened should she tell anyone what happened, and she wants to tell, but ends up finding herself unable to, and ends up resenting people for not asking her what's wrong, and ends up closing off relationships while simultaneously trying to sleep with other boys to prove that that is something that she can do, even though her first time was traumatic and was not a healthy sexual experience. This book discusses a lot of nuances about sexual assault and rape, and if this is a topic that you find yourself drawn to read about, I cannot highly recommend this more. My final 5-star read was Hey Kiddo. This is actually a graphic novel, but I didn't read it in that format. I read it as an audiobook. You might wonder, what is an audiobook of a graphic novel going to be like? And that's exactly what drew me to this. Basically, there was a lot of text that was written based on what you would see if you were reading it as a graphic novel to kind of fill out the plot points and that type of thing. And what made this adaptation incredibly special was a lot of the people that are in this graphic memoir were actually voiced by themselves or by family members of themselves. This is a graphic memoir about the author growing up and into his teens and finding out that his mother is a drug addict and she is in jail, and that's why he has been living with his grandparents, and what that family dynamic looks like, and the fact that he never knew his dad because his dad didn't take responsibility for him, and all of these things that happened in his adolescence. Like I mentioned, this is a full cast audiobook, and what I found super interesting about this project were people from his past actually came in to read lines for it. So when he's having a discussion with his high school art teacher, we are actually hearing his high school art teacher say those lines. Obviously not all of the people that are depicted in this graphic memoir are still alive, so some of the people were voice actors, but just listening to the cast list at the end made me cry. I'm not going to lie. This was also a special project because young Jared was actually voiced by his daughter. His best friend Pat was voiced by his best friend Pat, but when we were talking about the younger version of Pat, Pat was actually voiced by his son. And it's because I consumed it in this way and all of the story behind bringing this story together into this format, that's why this is my top read of the month, because I absolutely adored everything around that, and just listening to this book was phenomenal. If you want to hear me talk more about these books, or other books for that matter, the playlist for my weekly entertainment wrap-ups is always linked down below. If you've read any of these, please let me know about it down in the comments below. If you don't feel like leaving a comment but want to let me know that you were here, just leave me your favorite emoji or your least favorite emoji, and I'll have to try to figure out which one it is. On the way down in the comments, if you hit that subscribe button, that would be very nice of you. You can like and share this as you see fit, and I will see you very soon. Bye!